Okay, ladies and gentlemen, talk about Ohm's law. This is something we're going to get into it. Okay, so for Ohm's law, we need three things. Ohm's law. Okay, the only thing what Ohm's law does, it kind of tells you relationships between these three things. You should know these three things already. One is going to be voltage. Two is going to be amperage. And number three is going to be your ohms. Okay, these things are just measurements of different parts of electricity, so to speak. Your voltage is going to be a measurement of how much electrical pressure there is. Just like water in a water hose is measured in pounds per square inch, how much pressure is in there. PSI, pounds per square inch, is measured in a water hose. For electrical, you want to know how much electrical pressure is in a wire, it's measured in voltage. Same thing, you can measure amperage. You measure water flowing in a water hose. It's measured in gallons per minute. So GPM. So you're going to measure how many gallons a minute it is flowing. So if it flows more, you're going to have more gallons per minute. Just like if you have a little tiny hose, it's going to not flow very many gallons per minute. If you have a big old pipe, it's going to flow a lot. The same thing with amperage is your bigger wire is going to be able to handle more amperage than a smaller wire, because amperage is not gallons per minute, it's coulombs per second. So many coulombs, and a coulomb is what, 6.25 times, I think 10 to the 18th power or something like that. That is it's like a quadrillion coulombs. I don't know, it's a whole bunch. That many electrons going by one spot in 1 second is a coulomb. So if you have 1 coulomb going by a spot in 1 second, it's measured in amperage. So that would be 1 amp. 1 coulomb by 1 spot in 1 second is an amp. Just like 1 gallon past a point in 1 minute would be a gallon per minute. So coulombs per second is measured in amperage. Ohms is a resistance to that flow. So it's like a little hose that can't flow a whole lot of water because it's so tiny, it flows a little bit. So it has a lot of resistance to, like, you put a lot of pressure on there and you can still only flow so much water. But if you get a big giant pipe, it'll flow a bunch of water, okay? So same thing with ohms. A smaller wire, tinier wire, skinnier wire is going to have more resistance to flow. And so it's going to have a higher amount of ohms. A big giant wire, big fat wire, it's going to have less ohms because it's going to have less resistance, just like a water pipe or a tiny hose. So now, my big deal is to simplify this for you guys. And I want to get away from the E, I, and R, you know, the electromotive force, resistance, and amperage being I. So let's get away from that. And as a matter of fact, let's simplify these two, okay? So voltage, we're just going to call volts, all right? Same thing. Amperage, we're going to call amps. This is pretty much the typical slang you're going to have in the electrical world: volts, amps, and ohms, all right? So now, I'm going to sneeze here any second. Before we get into this, let's recap what a circuit is. Okay, a circuit needs three things. Remember, it needs a voltage source. If you remember, this is a symbol for a battery right there. We're going to use a symbol for a generator, okay, which is this. There's a symbol for a generator, and this is conductors, all right? And we're going to put a load on here. This is a symbol for a resistor. Now, so what Ohm's law does is it helps you figure out stuff you don't know. So you can design a circuit, or so you can measure stuff. You may not know all three, and you can figure out maybe what's wrong with that circuit. Why is that piece of equipment not operating like it's supposed to? You know, maybe it has low voltage. Maybe why is it drawing too many amps? Maybe it has high resistance, or maybe it has no ohms. It doesn't have enough resistance. So what we want to do is we want to go through this. Ohm's law is it's basically algebra, but I'm going to show you a trick so you don't have to use algebra. All right. So let's go over the complicated part first. That will make you appreciate the easy part. The complicated part is, let's say here's a first formula right here. It's E times I equals, nope. E equals I times R. Okay, so remember, we're not going to use a book, but this is how I learned it when I was like a pup like you guys long time ago. Is voltage equals your amperage times your ohms, okay? So for instance, in this case here, there's our voltage source right there, okay? We'll go ahead and put it back to a battery. Most people understand a battery better than a generator. Okay, so right now, let's say we don't know what our voltage is, but we know that this is going to be 10 ohms, okay? Well, let's call it 12. 12 ohms. And let's say this is 10 amps. So we got 10 amps of current flowing through a 12 ohm resistor. So we know by this formula right here, I times R, or amps times ohms, equals volts. So that would be 10 amps. That would be 10 times, somebody popping in here? Nope. Going to be 10 times your 10 amps times your 12 ohms. And that's going to equal 12 times 10 is going to be 120 volts. Okay? So now, so that's a simple formula. If you know your amps and you know your ohms, you can always find your voltage. Now what you can do is, if you don't, let's say you know your voltage. Let's say you already know it's 120 volts, but you don't know how many amps. You want to find out how many amps. So you don't know this one. Okay? So in algebra, what you would do is you would take, you divide both sides by the one you want to get by itself. So you would have E equals I times R. So you divide both sides by R, okay? And then this would cross itself out. So you basically have V equals A times your, volts times your amps. volts equals amps times your ohms. So you would divide your ohm like this. Okay, so this would cross out and you could figure out your amps. So you would have volts right here, which would be 120, okay, divided by your ohms, which is 12, going to equal 10. So there it is. It's 10 amps, just like it used to be. So let's put it over here. Let's say we have 120 volts, 10 amps, and 12 ohms. So now, let's say you knew your voltage, you knew your amps, but you didn't know your ohms. So now you would do the other thing. You would take E, and of course you would have, you divide this I, you get rid of that, okay? So it'd be E over I equals your R, which is basically your volts over your amps equals your ohms. Again, you got 120 on top, divided by your amps, which is 10, equals 12 ohms. Just like we got here, just like we had before I erased it. Now, this is the complicated way to do it. It's simple, but there's no reason to do all of this because I'm going to show you something super easy so you don't have to do all of this, okay? And when you think of Ohm's law, this is what most people think of, okay? So draw a circle like so, cut that circle in half, and then cut the bottom in half right there. Okay, instead of remembering all that, you just got to remember to draw one of these. And you put your volts on top, okay? It doesn't matter what side this goes on, but we'll just put our amps right here, and we'll put our ohms right here. You just got to remember the volts go on top. These two can go either side, it don't matter. So what you do, this is Ohm's law right here. This is the same thing as all of that stuff, all right? So what you're going to do is you're going to draw a circle like this. And if you want to find out the one you're missing, this always works all the time, 100% of the time. If you know two of them, you can always find the third one. So in this case, like the first one we did, is we were looking for our voltage. So let's say we don't know what our voltage is, right? But we do know that our amps, okay, amps is 10. We know we have 10 amps. And we know we have 12 ohms. So then all you got to do is multiply these two straight across. 10 times 12 equals 120 volts. Works every time, no matter what numbers there are. It always works. So you just got to multiply those two on the bottom. That's all you got to do. But let's say we already know we have 120 volts, but let's say we don't know our amps, all right? Then, if you know one on the bottom and you have your volts on top, all you got to do is divide the bottom one into the top one. And you fill in the empty square. So 120 divided by 12 is going to be 10 amps. Looky there. Imagine that. It worked again. Now, let's say we don't know our ohms. This is a big mystery. We don't know how many ohms we have. But we know we have 120 volts, so we know we have 10 amps. So you take this one, you divide it into there, and looky, it's just like freaking magic, 12 ohms. So, guys, this always works. This is as simple as Ohm's law gets right here. You don't really have to do all this stuff over here with these equations or memorizing, you know, you don't have to memorize E equals I times R. You don't have to memorize E over I equals R. You don't have to memorize E over R equals I. You don't have to like memorize V over voltage over ohms equals amps. You don't have to memorize voltage over amps equals ohms. You don't have to memorize voltage times, whoops, you have to memorize always voltage equals amps times ohms. I got too many I's and R's, and because I learned the I and R and E thing, so I have to transfer everything over in my head, and it's just like, I don't know why they do that. They should have just left, they should have just go with V, A, and ohms. But anyway, you don't have to memorize all this stuff. All you got to do is know this thing right here, okay? You know this thing, plug your numbers in, plug the 2 in you don't know, and you can find the other one. If you know the 2 bottom ones, okay, you multiply them to get the top one. And then if you know the top one and one of the bottom ones, and you take that one on the bottom and you divide it in the top, and you get your number for the one that's missing. Works every time. That's as simple as I can make Ohm's law. I mean, I don't know how else to make it more simple, but we're going to go over and we're going to practice some of this stuff later on, get into series and parallel circuits, how to calculate resistance and all that good stuff. But you guys need to get a handle on this before we move on. So, I mean, you don't have to know. You just got to I'm asking you just to memorize one thing: how to draw a freaking circle, how to put V on top, volts on top, amps here, and ohms here. Okay, if you can do that, you got Ohm's law. I mean, Ohm's law in 30 seconds, right? Anyway, all right.